Hey painting friends, it's Stoof. Welcome back to my channel. In this video, I'm going to give you a brief painting tutorial to recreate these seashells on the seashore. I used oil paint to create this painting as a commissioned piece for one of my clients. This is not the completed painting at the end of this video, but it's enough to get you going and teach you the basics for painting shells on the beach. We're going to start by mixing phthalo blue, phthalo green, and titanium white. You're going to primarily use titanium white, just mix a little bit of blue and an even smaller bit of green, and you're going to get that on a filbert brush. I'm using a 1/2 inch filbert brush here on a 12 by 16 inch canvas, and I'm just going back and forth on the top third of the canvas. I'm getting the entire top third nice and covered. I'm also painting the side borders here. That's something that I do for my clients. And once you have a really nice smooth blend of that color, you can add a bit more phthalo blue to your brush and blend that into the top part of your canvas at the top of the sky. If you want to add even a little more depth, you don't have to do that. You can also add a couple little white cirrus type clouds by just putting some white on your canvas and going back and forth in sweeping diagonal motions to add a little bit of clouds to your painting. After getting the top third of the canvas covered with your sky, now we are going to use that same brush, or you could switch to a 1/2 inch flat tip brush if you prefer, and you're going to make a straight line going across the canvas, just barely overlapping that sky you put down, trying not to leave any white space in between your water horizon line and the sky. So there might be a little bit of overlap and the paint might blend just a hair, but usually that just helps to build the sense of distance, so that's actually a good thing. To get the color for your water, you're going to mix more phthalo blue and more phthalo green, still using titanium white. If you want, you can add a hint of purple or a hint of burnt umber in there too. But for the water farthest in the distance, we're usually focusing most on phthalo blue. As we move to the more shallow part of the ocean water, we're using just phthalo green and white and blending that up into the ocean color that we already put down. You can blend a hint of ultramarine blue in there as well. Sometimes the part near the shore reflects a little bit more of the sky color and the light coming down and bouncing off of the water, so you get a hint more ultramarine blue in that instance. As you continue to move closer to the shore, now you're going to start to incorporate a little bit of rose blush, Naples yellow, and dioxazine purple into your mixture. Still keeping some phthalo green and white in the mixture as well. You're just starting to get a little bit of that sediment sand color as you're closer to the shore. You can start to see some of the sediment and sand through the water, so that's when we start to pick up some of those purples. And I'm not making the water perfectly horizontal at the shoreline where the water meets the beach. I want to have a bit of a diagonal there just to make it look like I'm glancing at the water from an angle, or the waves are coming in a manner that isn't perfectly horizontal from my vision plane. I'm continuing to work on the water by adding a bit more detail here, taking more of my phthalo blue and touching up the area close to the horizon line just to help build the depth of the scene and make the water look a little bit darker and deeper farther in the distance. I'm using a small flat tip brush here. I believe this is a number 6 flat tip brush. Just putting a little bit of that color down and blending back and forth, not making super sharp looking waves. I'm still keeping things a little fuzzy because Everything in the farther distance is going to be a little bit out of focus for this painting, where the seashells right in the foreground are the main focal point. After adding some deeper blues into the water, I'm blending some white with a hint of ultramarine blue and starting to add some highlights on the water. These could be breaking waves farther in the distance or just reflections of light on the water. An important thing to think about is as you are looking farther out in the distance, those lines of highlights and shadows are going to be more thin or narrow and closer together, and those highlights and shadows closer to the beach are going to have thicker paint lines because you're going to have a little bit more space there, and that helps you to perceive these things as closer to you, and the thin narrow lines help to be pushed farther back into the distance in your plane of vision. About halfway down from the top to the bottom, where I put water, I start to put some visible waves where I just take some pure titanium white and I'm getting that on my flat tip brush and I'm dragging it over top of the other wet paint so that it doesn't blend. I'm just very gently pressing on the canvas and letting that paint just kind of glide over, leaving those white marks. If you press hard, it's going to blend with the paint under it. If you're using acrylic paint, you can just wait until your blue dries and then add white, and then you don't have to worry about it blending at all. You need to put a couple little shadows under those breaking wave lines. And for the shadows, I'm mixing a little phthalo blue, phthalo green, and umber with titanium white. It's also blending a little with the colors on the canvas. That just helps to make that wave look like it's actually rolling over and breaking because there's a shadow under it. I'm adding a couple more breaking waves. These are all pretty mild waves. This is a calm seashore, so we're just showing like some bubbles and maybe like, a couple inch tall waves, nothing too crazy. As your waves are being painted closest to the shoreline, you can make the waves a little thicker and start to add a little bit more of that texture by just taking the brush and like turning it in different angles to get that white paint off of the brush and get the brush to create a little bit more of like a choppy brush mark rather than just a straight line. And after we're done with this ocean, we're ready to start painting in the base color for the sand. So for the base color of the sand, I started blending Naples yellow with rose blush and a little tiny hint of ultramarine blue and some dioxazine purple and white. You can make the color of your sand whatever you would like it to be. Usually sand is some variation of Naples yellow and white. There could be a hint more purple to it, or a hint more rose pinkish colors to it, or even more yellow, depending on the time of day and the mineralogy of the sand. To block in the base color for the sand, I'm using about a 1/2 inch wide flat tip brush and just going back and forth in a similar way that I painted in the sky. And I'm starting right where the water meets the beach and keeping the sand in that area for now. Right now I'm taking a little more dioxazine purple, umber, and a hint of black possibly, and I'm going at that shadow right where the water meets the beach, and I'm blending back and forth, building up the shadow a little bit darker under the waves and blending it into the sand to show where we have some wet sand, kind of where the waves are pulling back down into the ocean. I took a little bit of that shadow color and put a bit more of that in the sand, and now I'm sketching out the outlines for the seashells. We have a couple different variety of shells in here. This conch type of shell is definitely my favorite one. I think it's definitely an attention grabber in this painting. The completed painting has a little bit different variation, different layout of the seashells. My client, midway through the painting process, asked me to include a couple different seashells that weren't originally in the scene. So when I show you the finished painting, it's not going to look exactly like what it's looking like in this tutorial, but again, it's the same general process. So to sketch out the seashells and starfish on the shore, you first just want to get the general shape and outline of each one. For the conch shell there, you can see that there are a few different planes, so that's going to be the trickiest one. The starfish isn't quite as difficult. Just think about it in shapes and angles. You want to look at the angle. If you hold your brush up at that angle and then move your arm to hold the brush over the canvas, that can help you to visualize how those shapes need to be sketched out. I wouldn't go too crazy on the tiny little spikes that might be in each of the shells when you're just getting that general sketch. Focus more on the overall shape, and then you can add, if there are little spikes coming out from different angles, you can add those in when you start to detail the shells. And luckily, a lot of these seashells come in different shapes and sizes, so if your angles are slightly off or your proportions are off, it's likely not going to be that noticeable unless it's something major, which you can always layer over and fix if you see that something looks off later on. After sketching in the layout for the seashells, I'm now able to go back around and paint in the rest of my sand. I'm also painting in some shadows. I want to have the light source all coming from the same place, so it looks like my light source is somewhere midday, casting just a hint more of a shadow closer to the viewer, and that's going to help build the depth in this painting as well, seeing shadows under the seashells. To get that shadow color, I'm just mixing a little bit of ultramarine blue and umber with my sand color. You can see as I'm painting in the sand, there are a few areas with more variations of pink and yellows, and some areas have a little more of the cooler variation, and that's totally fine. If your sand is all exactly one same color, then it's going to look like the sand is perfectly flat with no divots or anything like that. And usually when you go to the beach, there are a couple little divots and little tiny sinkholes and stuff like that in the sand. Alright, now that the sand base layer of paint is down, we got some minor shadows placed around the shells. Now it's time for the fun part, adding all of the colors and highlights and shadows to our shells. So I'm starting on the shell that is the largest one, farther in the background, mixing some cadmium orange with cadmium yellow and white to get started there. Also blending in a hint of my purple and some of my browns too as we're getting closer to the shadow side. So the top part of the shell is getting the most light, and the side that is facing a little bit further away from us is also getting a lot of light. And this shell has a lot of reflective properties, so the top part of that shell is almost pure white in some places. So for every shell on your top part of the shell, you're going to have more of your warm, bright colors, and on the shadowy side of your shell, you're going to have more of the browns, blues, and purples. Here I'm starting to block in a bit of that white highlight that I mentioned. And I also let that blend a bit with some of the existing colors I put down just to help brighten those up a bit more. Show that there's like a nice reflection on that shell. And this is the trickiest part of this shell here. I did struggle a bit with this because there's a flat top part of the shell and then there's a vertical part going closer towards the swirly tip top of the shell. So the part that is vertical towards the tippy top part of the shell is catching more light, and the horizontal, or like the flat part, is catching a bit more shadow. So keep that in mind too. You don't want to use the same values here because then it's not going to read properly and it's going to look like a flat, weird cone instead of having these layers building up the swirly top part of the conch shell. As I'm moving to the next shell, you can see I start with more of the shadow values and colors, and then we start to add the highlights over top of them. Again, if you're using acrylic paint instead of oil paint, this might be easier for you if you are a beginner because you can just wait for that shadow color to dry and then you can layer over with those white and light gray purple highlights. For the starfish, we're moving to next in the lower right corner. We start out with some pure white, and then I start to blend in more browns and black, maybe a hint of purple as well. Focusing on the shadowy side, basically the left pointing star pieces are more in shadow. Again, I'm starting with the shadows in the next shell in the lower center. This shell has an opening facing the viewer, and there's a really deep shadow in that part that kind of fades into more of a yellow-orange. So I'm blending that there, just going back and forth with the brush. Here I'm just going back into the sand and making some little squiggles with the shadow color of the sand, a little more umber and purple in there. That's helping to show the texture of the sand a bit more. Then we can add some highlights onto the sand later. Now moving to the shells on the lower left side. This shell is upside down and there's some sand in it. And this shell is just like a teeny little conch looking shell. And again, I'm focusing on the shadows more, and then I start to add a little bit more highlight later. Alright guys, and with that, I think we've covered the basics for painting shells on a beach. After getting this blocked in, you can go back in with more detail like I did if you would like. Here's what the finished painting looked like. I went back in, boosting highlights, refining more of those little bumps and spikes in the shells, adding tiny little lines for the detail in the shells. That's something you can totally do on your end if you would like to. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial and found it helpful for painting shells on the beach. If you have recommendations for future painting tutorials, let me know in the comments. Thanks and happy painting! Bye bye!